Today's video is a very difficult one to make and review because it's all about sound quality. Full disclosure, this is not a review totally of the HomePod. It's just comparing sound quality from my previous favorite smart home speaker, the Google Home Max, to now the brand new Apple HomePod. Let's begin. Now, I hope I don't have to reiterate to everyone everything every other reviewer has already said. It only plays Apple Music, it doesn't support Spotify, it's very limiting to Apple's ecosystem. Yeah. You've heard all that before. Today, I want to talk about briefly what we've discovered when comparing the HomePod sound to the Google Home Max's sound. Because you've been watching my channel for a while, you realize that the Google Home Max, for a while, was like my favorite Google product ever. They went all out on that speaker and made sure that it sounded amazing. It gets crazy loud, oftentimes too loud. In fact, one of my complaints with it, which was a good complaint, was that at 100% volume, it's almost not usable. It's so loud that any room you'd be in with the Home Max at 100% volume, it'd be hard to talk to someone or even think, just because it's so crazy loud. So for the first time on Tailosive Tech, we did a little bit of audio testing to try to, in some way, shape, or form, convey to you how the speakers sound differently. So what we did was we took the microphone that I'm recording with right now, and we've discovered that recording these speakers with a microphone from further away gives a better example of the difference in quality. So since this is a pretty big room, we measured and made sure the microphone was 30 feet away from both of these speakers, and we had both of them playing the exact same song, and we just cut back and forth between the Home Max's volume at 100% and the HomePod's volume at 100%. And to give you just a juxtaposition to a typical Bluetooth speaker, we threw in the UE Mega Boom, which I reviewed a few months back, just so you get an idea of what, a cheap $130 Bluetooth speaker sounds like next to the HomePod in the Google Home Max. So here you go.
You should. I cannot give you this. You just young, dumb, and broke. Young, dumb, and broke. Young, dumb, young. Feel the thunder, lightning and the thunder.
So yeah, maybe listening to this with headphones or something may help, I'm not sure. But hearing a lot of people talk about the HomePod, I want to make one thing very clear. It is not louder than the Home Max. That much is obvious. And in fact, that's something that I was predicting about the HomePod sound quality, is that it would be more crisp and easier to listen to. But in sheer volume, the Max is just so large, so powerful, you cannot beat the Home Max in terms of smart speakers with its incredible volume. However, just as I suspected, that HomePod is a lot easier to listen to because even at 100% volume, we don't really pick up a lot of distortion. That's the one thing me and my friend both realized while recording this video, is that the Max, while yes, louder, you start to hear like the trebles crack a little bit. That audio quality that the Max usually has when you're playing music at a lower volume, like 50% or 30%, which is more typical for people listening to music. I think it'd be very difficult to listen to the Home Max at 100% volume at all the time. Just too crazy loud. But when the Home Max is turned up all the way, you start to get that muffled sound. If you ever go on YouTube and look up bass boosted things, it's kind of like a minute version of that. When the Home Max is turned up all the way, things are a little too piercing to the ears. Whereas we notice with the HomePod, while not being as loud, when you turn it up all the way, not really distorted at all. No matter how loud it gets, you can still make out every little detail in the song, and we hear very little crackling in the trebles and bass. It's very clear to listen to, which definitely seems like something Apple would pay attention to. They'd be like, well, we're not going to focus on sheer volume, we want it to be an all-around good speaker, which means that even when you set it to 100%, because we know that's something everyone loves to do with speakers, see how loud they can be. No matter how loud the HomePod gets, it is still audible and it doesn't get to a point where the audio itself is piercing. One stark difference I'd say between my use with the Home Max and the HomePod is basically we could never really set the Max to 100% volume unless we wanted to hurt ourselves. We basically would be like, oh no, the Max is gonna play at 100 now, and we wouldn't let it play for 100 over than like 20 seconds, maybe. Because after just a little while with the Max playing that loud, it's like, okay, that's enough, too much. Whereas the HomePod, when you set it to 100% volume, can still retain that crisp audio and fill the room. And that brings me to my next point. The Max is not omnidirectional, where the HomePod is. We also compared the HomePod versus the Home Max sound quality when facing away from the microphone. And I'm not sure exactly if you'll be able to pick up the difference, but I'll give you an example anyway.
Thunder, feel the thunder.
So perhaps since you're watching this video on your own set of speakers, you may not feel it, but when we were in the room, we noticed a giant difference between especially the bass quality between the HomePod and the Home Max when we turned them around. Of course, we just turned the HomePod around for the sake of it. We didn't really notice any difference in sound quality, but when the Home Max is facing away, we don't really notice the subwoofers as much, which makes sense because while the Home Max has two subwoofers and it can get a lot louder, that bass that goes through the air doesn't bounce off the walls as well, and I think is a bit more directional, and the HomePod is focused on making sure that bass is uniform and goes in all directions. I know that both of these speakers use a type of technology that senses the room around them and tries to output audio in specific ways depending on the room they're in, but regardless, I think it's safe to say that the HomePod has a lot more consistent quality. I can rely on that no matter where I'm standing on the room. It's going to sound the same. It's going to have the same bass and kicks to it, whereas the Max, you kind of have to orient in a proper direction. Or if you want to expand that direction and get that premium quality from a Home Max, it probably helps to buy two, but at that point you're looking at like an $800 setup. Important point to remember that the HomePod is a little bit cheaper. Stereo mode is not available yet, and I wish it was. I personally would have been okay if Apple delayed the HomePod launch a little bit longer and we had to wait till March or maybe just the end of February so that Apple could get that stereo mode working. People on the iOS 11 beta got the pop-up for stereo mode, but the firmware update for the HomePods to support stereo mode is actually not out yet, so no one's been able to do it. Even though iOS 11 says it's working, it's really only playing on one speaker. But my point is, if you're looking for a speaker for the home and you have a fairly large room, when comparing the Home Max and HomePod, again, disregarding all of the connectivity limitations of the HomePod not supporting Spotify or not being able to pair via Bluetooth, just AirPlay, I think the HomePod is going to be a more uniform experience, as in people are going to understand it a little bit better. One thing I've noticed with the Home Max is when people go up to it, they're confused on how to stop playing music or how to change the volume because it just kind of has this tiny bar at the top, and most of the time you have to explain to people that nope, you press that to get it to stop, and then to change volume it's a giant trackpad. What's nice about the HomePod is it just has a plus and minus on the top, so when people want to change the volume they understand it a lot better. They're like, oh, plus and minus, okay, that's the volume, and then most people can assume that, you know, just touching the top does something, and yes, that either activates Siri if you hold it or it actually pauses the music. And one fun thing I like to do with the HomePod is the same thing I do with my Apple Watch. When I want to silence it, I can just slap it to get it to turn off, and especially in portrait mode, if you do that to the Home Max, it does not end well. But of course, you can use the Home Max in stereo. By the way, the reason we did not compare sound quality with the Home Max in stereo mode was because we figured that stereo mode is not yet available on the HomePods. And as someone who's had the Home Max for a long time, I can tell you that the differences between it standing upright and sideways, sound-wise, doesn't really do anything. Stereo mode, when the speakers are this close to each other, doesn't make a huge difference. But the other thing I was curious about was voice recognition under high volumes. One issue we ran into pretty often with the Google Home Max was when we would set it to 100% volume, it no longer could hear us. You'd have to get pretty close to it for it to actually register. Oh, he's saying Google. Okay, start listening now. But with the HomePod, even when it was set to 100% volume, most of the time it was able to hear us. Not 100% of the time. There would still be certain songs, I think, that would cause the HomePod to play audio so loudly that the microphone wouldn't be capable of picking you up. But perhaps it's just because the HomePod doesn't get quite as loud.
Good listening.
The HomePod, I think, does a better job at hearing you say Siri when at max volume compared to the Home Max, which I would say is a little bit of a defect, as this is meant to be a hands-free speaker. When it's across the room and it's set to 100, now you can't really get it to stop unless you get closer. Oftentimes, we just shout at the Home Max, and if you're too far away from it, it just can't hear you. Whereas I think the HomePod balanced that more properly. So I'm debating whether or not I should review the HomePod entirely in its own separate video when stereo mode comes out, or if I should just tell you what I think now. You guys could definitely let me know what you would prefer to see in the comments below. But as of right now, I think I might want to wait until stereo mode is available, and then we can review it entirely. Or if you guys prefer, I can just review it as it is right now and let you know my thoughts on it. But overall, very satisfied with it, and it lives up to my expectations, which were that the Google Home Mini, the regular Google Home, and of the Amazon Echo speakers I've heard, I don't own any, they all seem a little bit too lacking in quality to be good enough for me, and that's why I love the Home Max so much. But then at the same time, the Home Home Max is fairly expensive for a smart speaker and gets pretty dang loud, a little too loud, like you never want to set it to 100. Whereas I think Apple found that perfect middle ground with the HomePod and said, okay, this, when it's at 100%, is very loud, very clear, and it's not quite as big or as expensive as a Home Max is. So if we had a big chart here with budget, not as good quality Google speakers on this end, Amazon Dot, all the way up to the Google Home Max up here, I'd say the HomePod would be a little bit cheaper, but really good in sound quality below the Home Max, which I definitely hope is more of a field all of these smart speaker companies decide to invest in, making something that sounds really good, but doesn't completely break the buck. Let me know all your thoughts on the HomePod in the comments below, and if you want me to wait for stereo mode or just go ahead and review it now. It's all up to you guys. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you in the next one.